Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again, and today's video is a double review where I'll cover two books that I read recently and that stretch our assumptions and challenge our conceptions about sexuality and gender, both social gender and biological gender, by imagining characters and even entire planets that move beyond and outside the commonly assumed binary opposition between male and female. These two novels are Middlesex by Eugenides, which I reread last week more than 10 years after I read it for the first time, and The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Guin, which had been at the very top of my reading list for a very long time, way too long certainly. Let's start with Eugenides. Middlesex is an engrossing, engaging, compelling tale told by an irresistible narrator who has a knack for inserting themselves within the story they're telling, for using metafiction in a very easygoing, very compelling manner. The novel's narrator and protagonist, Cal, is somebody who is intersex, as he reveals himself in the rather pyrotechnic opening paragraph of the novel. If you're on the fence in any way about reading Middlesex, you should read that opening paragraph, and if that doesn't convince you to read the book, I'll eat my hat. Cal is a hermaphrodite. He is somebody who, because of certain peculiarities of his biology that were undiscovered when he was born, was raised as a girl up until he was a teenager, when his status as a hermaphrodite was discovered, and he decided to live as a male. The consequences of this change, of this moment in his personal life, are vast and hard to grasp, and might really go beyond even the most easy assumptions that we can make about him, about his personal life and about his identity. One of the points Cal wonders is whether he is going to tell a story that is going to follow more of a circular and supposedly feminine structure, or more of a linear and supposedly masculine structure. The story Cal is going to tell, however, goes well beyond his own personal life story. In fact, in pure Tristram Shandy fashion, Cal doesn't even appear into the book until well into it. And instead, Middlesex is first and foremost a sweeping family saga, a story of characters traveling from Greece, escaping war and persecution, and coming to America in the hope of finding a new and better life for themselves. This change for the characters from old world silk farmers to Midwesterns, workers and homeowners, fighting their own guilt, fighting their own personal demons, is the one great metamorphosis that occurs throughout the book, and that evolves almost in parallel and side by side with Cal's own metamorphosis. The nature and the limits of this metamorphosis might also be rooted within the characters, much more than they are dictated by their external environment. Let me rephrase this. You would think that nationality is a fairly objective matter, right? That it's something that's imposed from the outside and is an obvious fact beyond questioning. Nothing further from the truth. Desdemona and Lefty, Cal's grandparents, both come to America at the same time in the early 20s. But while Lefty manages to adapt to American life fairly easily, Desdemona never really leaves behind the small village in Asia Minor where she's from, and she will keep living in that village, in her inner and private life, if not in reality, even decades after she's left it forever, even decades after she's been living in America. Or consider, for instance, Milton, Cal's father, the son of Greek migrants, growing up in the Greek community of Detroit, who, however, sees himself as very much an American man, who disdains the old traditions of Greece with its religion, its superstition, who in fact is a fairly aggressive Republican, who puts America's foreign interests before Greece's. And because of this, he will actually fall out with many of his friends of Greek descent. The irony here is that when he is confronted with the discovery of Cal's biological status, Milton approaches this discovery very much as something that needs to be cured, something that needs to be fixed, so that she can continue living as a girl, the way she was raised. Even if biologically, when it comes to her chromosomes, she's a man, he is a man. And the irony here is that, of course, gender identity goes well beyond matters of biology or upbringing, in the same way as one's nationality goes well beyond matters of the location of your birth or your own upbringing. National identity, just as gender, are very much of a performance. And it's for this reason that Milton can play the gung-ho American at the same time as his friends from the Greek community can find their identity rooted more closely into their ancestral homelands in Europe, in Greece. As I mentioned before, this was a rereading of Middlesex for me. I remember the first half of the novel dealing with the story of Cal's family traveling to America, finding employment, finding a home in Detroit very well, up to very minute details of the plot, which doesn't happen that often with me, if I have to be honest, especially with books that I read so long ago. But the second half of the novel was much blurrier in my memory. Part of this, I'm certain, was due to the very simple fact, to put it bluntly, that when I read the novel for the first time, I was still a teenager and I was probably not well versed in human anatomy enough to understand the finer details of, let's say, Cal's peculiar biological status. Upon rediscovering this second half of the novel, what really surprised me was in particular one strand of it, one little subplot inserted in the story of Cal's life, which is the story of his relationship with the obscure object, the way he refers to a young woman that he meets as a teenager and who becomes his first crush. And this story, the story of these two characters, their friendship, how they come together, how they discover their first love, how they discover themselves and their desire, is told in such an insightful and delicate and beautiful manner. It was one of the hidden jewels in the novel, and I think that a different novelist would have been well contented with taking this single story, with its details and its fine revelations, and turn it into a novel in its own right, really. Now, Middlesex is not free from controversy. I don't think that any novel that deals with gender and identity in such a way as Middlesex could possibly be free from controversy. One of the points commentators have remarked on, for instance, is the fact that Cal decides, once his biological nature is revealed to him by doctors, he decides to live as a man because he finds himself attracted to women. And so he thinks, well, if that's the case, then I'm a man. Without realizing that, of course, being attracted to women is very much an option, even if you identify yourself as a woman. There's nothing wrong with that. It's up to each reader, of course, to decide how much slack they're willing to cut to the novel, and it's of course important to read it critically, as I said, and to remark, to point out where the book is falling short, where the book is not considering things delicately enough or not being imaginative or clear enough. But at the same time, I do believe that there is more to be gained by approaching the novel, by focusing on the positive line, the positive light that it can shine on the way we construct our ideas of ourselves, our ideas of our gender identity, by focusing on the good rather than by stressing the pitfalls and the flaws of the novel. One thing that struck me as problematic, and that doesn't necessarily have to do with gender, is how non-committal and even apolitical the novel appears to be. Following in this way Cal's own inclination, he is admittedly apolitical as a narrator. It's almost as if the novel is so concerned with Cal's private life and Cal's private parts, really, that it doesn't really give enough attention to the larger social and communal questions that are at play within its story. Which is very much of a pity, because this is not really just a story about Cal's own childhood and adolescence and his discovery of himself. It is very much a story about the broader characters that compose it, a story about the systematic racism and xenophobia against migrants, both in the workplaces of America and in the suburbs. And it's very much a story about the city of Detroit that touches extensively upon the Detroit riots in 1967. These agitations and the fighting associated with the riots started in the African American community and escalated to the point where the government brought in the National Guard and the army to repress it. And Middlesex, on the one hand, makes a very bold claim that these riots weren't so much a disorganized riot, but very much of a revolution. But at the same time, I found that it didn't really shine a light for me on the humane and the deeper reasons why these riots came to be, on the reason why these people decided to choose violence as a way of claiming a better life, of protesting their living conditions. Because to be honest, the African Americans of Detroit portrayed within Middlesex appear as a bit gullible, a bit comical, a bit careless and even sloppy. I thought that this vagueness when dealing with this important historical moment was puzzling, to say the least, and it was almost as if the novel wanted to point toward a certain historical trend, toward the possibility of making a political point about this moment in American history, without being brave enough to commit and actually make the point. It was a disappointing treatment of the events for me, and again, it was mostly a huge pity, considering that the novel is otherwise such a loving and such a detailed story of Detroit as a city, of its booming years, its greatness, but also its terrible problems and its decadence. So Middlesex challenges and stretches our minds by imagining a protagonist that lives outside the standard binary opposition between male and female, man and woman. But that is nothing compared to the trippiness of The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, a novel set on a planet, Gethen, where the inhabitants are humans. They are very much humans, but all of them are hermaphrodite. These humans are not split into men and women. Instead, all of them don't really have a gender. They're neutral in this sense, and they can become men or women, biologically speaking, during intercourse, so that a single person might father a child at one point in their life, but also carry a baby and be a mother at another point in their life. Biologically, they are capable of serving both roles. It's a very stimulating and exciting concept, and one that really stretches your mind as you're exploring all of its implications in the way this planet and this society, and societies, I should use the plural, are structured. But let's proceed with order. Le Guin's triumphant world building in The Left Hand of Darkness is sparse and yet effusive. This is not a novel that spends much time at all giving you many details about the cities on this alien planet, or its history, or its philosophy, or its governments. In fact, it's a fairly short book that feels like it's all plot. Le Guin's own concession to exposition is one single chapter about Gethen's biology, which is only like 4 pages long, and one note about the calendar on this planet, which, to be honest, I didn't even read. I only read it last. And yet, in spite of all this, I felt like, as I was reading the novel, I had a full and serviceable understanding of Gethen's architecture, of its agriculture, its commerce, the nature of life on this planet, the nature of the various philosophical religious groups on the planet, the nature of the governments, the two main governments that control the majority of the inhabitable land on this planet. And of course I felt like I had a real sense of Gethin's harsh climate. Gethin is a frozen world. Most of it is covered by ice, and the rest of it is tormented constantly by snow and by freezing temperatures. The paradox of these world-building efforts being so sparse and yet so effective is magical up to a certain point, and very much has to do with Le Guin's capacity for using every word, every sentence to paint the broader, believable picture of this world she is creating. David Mitchell describes this very well in the introduction to the edition I read, where he said that this feels like one of those worlds that is not just contained within the story that creates it. This feels like the type of world that is still out there and is still evolving, where things are still happening even after you finish reading the book. It feels like it's out there even if nobody is reading about it or writing about it. The same type of writerly genius applies to Le Guin's characterization. Within just a few works, with just a few strokes, Le Guin is able to portray somebody's personality without relying on cliches or easy tropes or exaggeration. One of my very favorite characters in the novel is the protagonist's landlady, who is only in the novel for something like 3 paragraphs, and yet is described so brilliantly as somebody who had fat buttocks that wagged as he walked, and a soft fat face, and a prying, spying, ignoble, kindly nature. He was good to me, and also showed my room while I was out to thrill seekers for a small fee. See the mysterious envoy's room. It's the best characterization of a landlady, even an archetypal landlady, that I've ever read. The novel's protagonist, Jen Liai, is, as we just read, an envoy. He is a human from Earth who has traveled across space to approach the people of Gethin, of this planet, and bring them the possibility of joining the Ecumen, an alliance of human planets scattered across the galaxy. He is very much of a hero and a courageous and brave soul, but his idealism does not feel at all saccharine. Instead, it is always very believable. Jenly's mission and morals and acts are enlightening without feeling unlikely. At one point late in the novel, he tells the king of Karhide that he doesn't work to serve the Ecumen, this alliance that he's trying to promote. He works to serve mankind. And this is a heartbreaking moment that brought tears to my eyes, because it doesn't just feel like an empty slogan, like some kind of aggressive moniker. It's not the tagline of some action movie. Instead, it's a beautiful message in its simplicity and clarity. Both Genly and Estraven, the co-protagonist of this story, are trying their best to serve the general interests of their people, to advance human evolution and knowledge and understanding. And they do so in their own fallacious, flawed way, within the limits of their own power. The simple and noble nature of these two heroes is very much part of the book's general low-key atmosphere of adventure. For a story that, as I mentioned, is basically all plot, all moving forward, and one where the stakes couldn't be higher. This is not a bombastic or explosive story. This alien planet is not filled with floating cities or giant reptiles. Even the evil of the novel's scheming politicians and secret police is not diabolical and tyrannical. In fact, it is quite banal and subtle and systematic and predictable, and for this reason it is all the more believable. In fact, Orgorein, which is one of the two great nations that control most of Gethin, a place of universal employment, great luxury, and great abundance, is one of the most disturbing and believable, again, dystopias that I've encountered in quite a while. The novel's general abstinence from excess and theatricality goes hand in hand with two major elements of it. Its setting, this world of ice, of immobility, a world that requires constant grazing and great patience, great strategy, and a bit of luck in order to survive. And it goes hand in hand with the novel's philosophy, with its philosophy of duality and balance, a philosophy that opposes single-mindedness and tries to show how obtuse extreme thought and extremes in general can be. The Left Hand of Darkness, in the same way as Middlesex does, deals with matters of gender and identity in the way that novels are best equipped to do. Not by trying to solve the great dilemmas and debates as to how we can establish or define these things, but by showing the endless varieties of experience and the inevitable contradictions and paradoxes that are part of human life. Showing in this way how pointless it is to hold any type of exclusive obtuse view on these matters. Where does biology end and personality begin? What's the role of evolution as opposed to upbringing in determining somebody's identity? Even if we identify certain trends within a group, can we really ever escape the influence of personality, of individual variations? In one of my very favorite passages from the novel, Genly and Estraven are talking about women. Estraven, as a hermaphrodite on a world of hermaphrodites, has never met a woman. In fact, the only man he's ever met is Genly himself from outer space. And so he asks Genly, how do women differ from men? Are they like a different species? And Genly's reply, which I think is genius, is no, yes. The point being, these questions have no answers. They're difficult, complicated, ever-changing, and ultimately impossible to acknowledge. And if there's one thing that The Left Hand of Darkness teaches us, is that knowing the answer to a question is usually less useful and much more besides the point than we tend to assume. Both of these are stimulating reads. Middlesex is a truly pleasurable reading experience. It's really engaging, really engrossing. Left Hand of Darkness is perhaps a bit more difficult. I found it slightly difficult in the first, call it 50 pages or so, while I was still getting to grips with the nature of this alien planet, but it is an incredibly stimulating reflection on so many aspects of human life, of society, philosophy, on the very nature of existence, and it went well beyond my expectations, even though I knew how much of a classic, of a masterpiece of science fiction it's regarded to be. I'm gonna terminate, make a final point about these novels' discussion on gender and biological/sexual identity by quoting Le Guin herself from her introduction to the book, where she says that yes, in Left Hand of Darkness, indeed there are people in it who are androgynous. And that doesn't mean that I'm predicting that in a millennium or so we will all be androgynous, or announcing that I think we damned well ought to be androgynous. I'm merely observing, in the peculiar, devious and thought-experimental manner proper to science fiction, that if you look at us at certain odd times of day, in certain weather, we already are. I very much look forward to hearing what you think about these novels, whether you also enjoyed them, whether you had any strong criticism of either that I haven't covered. I know that Left Hand of Darkness was also criticized by many feminist scholars, especially upon publication. I look forward to discussing this. I very much look forward to reading more of Le Guin, probably starting with The Dispossessed. And I just wanted to thank you all so much for watching the video, to thank my patrons for supporting the YouTube channel, and to thank Skillshare for sponsoring the video. Skillshare is an online community of creators and creatives offering a broad array of video classes on all sorts of topics, from creative writing to gardening, from cooking to illustration to design. There is something for everybody on Skillshare. It's an awesome place where you can discover new skills or explore your creativity in a very relaxed, very friendly atmosphere. A class that I took recently and that I loved was Always Drawing: How to Start and Keep a Daily Sketchbook by Mike Lowery. This was a hilarious class that communicated in simple and engaging terms the joys one can find in letting their creativity flow free, and in finding a space every day to turn your thoughts and experiences into sketches. Finding this type of inspiration was exactly one of the reasons that drew me to Skillshare, and Mike's class proved full of wonderful tips on how to make the most of my drawing time. It was also a pleasure to experience, since he's just so funny and is so generous in sharing his gorgeous sketchbooks with his viewers. I am hoping that this class will encourage me to find sources of inspiration for my own sketches within my everyday life and enrich my appreciation of my moments of creativity. I highly recommend you check Skillshare out. There is a link at the top of the description box, and the first 1,000 people to click on that link or to use my code TheBookChemist will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Thank you again for watching, and bye everybody.